Co-host over at Hill TV's Rising, Krystal went on CNN to defend Bernie Sanders on the issue of electability. Let's take a look, then we're going to come back and talk about it.
The question for Bernie Sanders is this. If he is the Democratic nominee, can he attract conservative Democrats? Can he attract moderate, maybe never Trump Republicans to win in November? Joining me now to discuss, CNN political commentator Ana Navarro and co-host of Rising on Hill TV, Krystal Ball. I want to establish a baseline before we even begin this discussion. Ana, let me start with you on this. Does the Democratic nominee need moderate Republicans or never Trump Republicans to win in November?
But a basic question, does the Democratic nominee need to be a Democrat to win the nomination? And it's looking increasingly like maybe not. But look, it depends. It depends on the formula you use to get to the 270 electoral votes, right? If your formula includes places like Florida, I would tell you yes. If your Florida includes some of the places that were lost by less than 7,000 votes, then you have independents, you have moderate Democrats, and you certainly have disenfranchised Republicans, never Trumpers, who could make that difference. Or you need to make it up from being able to take out that Obama coalition to the streets that didn't go out in the same level as they did in 2012. Either way, you've got to come up with a formula for 270.
So, Krystal, to you, do you think a Democratic nominee needs to worry about attracting Republicans?
I think Ana lays it out well. There are a couple of routes to get here, but I actually don't think you have to pick either or. And with Bernie Sanders, look, we know that he excites the base. We know he's going to bring out more young people and probably more working class, diverse communities that stayed home in 2016. But we can look at his 30-year electoral history in Vermont to see how he does with those more moderate and conservative voters. Now, look, Vermont overall obviously is a more liberal state at this point, but there were 61 towns that voted for Donald Trump. Of those 61 towns, Bernie Sanders won 47 of them. Now compare that to Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, where there were 91 towns that went for Trump. She was only able to win back 4 of them. So we can see actually Bernie Sanders has outperformed in the kind of deindustrialized towns in Vermont that are very similar to those key swing states in the industrial Midwest.
The question, is it an either or? And Ana, I think this is where you come in as someone who has spent your life in the Republican Party, as someone who has been a lifelong Republican. How comfortable would you be voting for someone who calls himself a socialist?
I am incredibly uncomfortable about it. Problem for me is that I am most uncomfortable voting for Donald Trump. That for me is not an option. But I can tell you that there's something, look, 2 things about Bernie Sanders. Number one, this is who he is. And at 76, 78, whatever he is not going to change. And he can't change because people would question his authenticity. But in places like Florida, and for people like Republicans and moderates, and I realize people in the Democratic primary don't care. When they say you screwed up your own house, go take care of that, they've got a point. That being said, when we hear the word socialist, I fled communism.
Well, as
did so many
right?
Cuban Americans in Miami.
There's Cuba, there's Venezuela.
There's Venezuela. There is a reason why Donald Trump is dragging out the Democratic John Guaido from Venezuela at the State of the Union, because it triggers us emotionally. And when we see these videos of Bernie Sanders talking about the Sandinistas and talking about the Soviet Union and talking about Cuba, it gives us the EBGBs. That's just the bottom line. At the same time, I recognize that there's a lot of young people who embrace what Bernie Sanders is saying. I have friends who tell me their children were in Iowa. People from Miami. You don't go to Iowa in January and February if you are from Miami, because they were there campaigning for Bernie Sanders.
Let me just put up some poll numbers here. This is from the Wall Street Journal, I believe, and it has to do with if people are comfortable with a candidate being a socialist. 46%, very uncomfortable, 21%, some reservations, that up to 67%. Ana used a political science term for this, Krystal, which is the heebie-jeebies. And you acknowledge that they exist for a lot of voters. You know, whether Democrats absolutely 100% need them, I don't know, but they'd sure be convenient if you want to win an election.
Yeah, but if you look at the polling, I mean, when it's not just some hypothetical socialist, the polling shows that Bernie Sanders is the best candidate in terms of electability versus Trump at this point. It used to be Biden. Sanders has closed that gap now to where he consistently outperforms Biden on that measure of electability. Look, I think the bottom line is, and this is core to my own political philosophy, economic populism is an electoral winner. Why? Because it's a unifying message across the working class. Bernie Sanders focusing on healthcare, on wages, on labor rights, on clean air and clean water. These are things that are not partisan issues, as he loves to say, which I think is a great point. Republicans get sick too. They care about their healthcare as well. And to the point about the Latino community and the importance there, that is an incredibly important electorate with very diverse views. And I never want to paint with a broad brush. But if we look in this primary, there's one candidate who disproportionately outperforms with Latinos, and that's Bernie Sanders. That's why he's very likely to win the Nevada caucuses. I mean, we've seen polling that have shown him up over 50% with Democratic primary voters in the Latino community. So his strength there is also going to be incredibly important in many of these swing states.
The thing that always gets me about these conversations with Bernie and electability is they're always the same. They're always concern trolling, like, oh, well, what about the moderates? What about the moderates? How do we make sure they turn out to vote? But they never turn it around and ask, okay, well, how do we make sure that the left base turns out? How do we make sure that the left side of the party is energized enough about the specific candidate that they want to turn up and show up and vote? And in fact, that's the more important part of elections. There was a famous study done by Matthew Dowd. Now, he found that the number of persuadable independents, those are people who are registered as independents, but, might vote Republican and might vote Democrat, that number has dropped from 22% down to 7%. Now it's probably even less. So what's that mean? It means that the number of people who, could go either way is really, really low at this point. And so the question of elections now is, how do we make sure that the people who, if they are going to show up and vote, they're going to vote for you? How do we make sure that those people show up and vote? And you know what? The best candidate to be able to do that is Bernie Sanders. He's able to turn up and energize voters in a way that other candidates aren't able to do. Bernie Sanders is able, like, you think if you have all these people giving $20, $30, $5 to the candidate, you think those candidates aren't going to show, you think those voters aren't going to show up and vote for Bernie Sanders? Of course they are. They gave the guy $20. Of course they're going to show up and vote for him. That's how you do it, right? These people are energized. They're actually going to show up for him. In fact, let me show you this poll right here. This is from The Hill, recent poll. Donald Trump beats every single Democratic candidate except for Bernie Sanders. Now, look, to be fair, there's been other polls. Let me make it bigger so you can see these numbers here. Bernie Sanders, 4.6% in terms of, beating Donald Trump. The, Buttigieg, 2.2. Now, Joe Biden here, 4.8. But you'll notice Bernie Sanders is the only candidate other than Elizabeth Warren, and we'll get to her numbers in a minute, who doesn't have any polls which show Donald Trump leading. But Elizabeth Warren numbers, she's only +2. Bernie Sanders seems to be the most consistently electable candidate on that list. And the thing you need to understand, guys, is when it comes to Joe Biden, for instance, there's a lot of people who will answer the phone and be like, yeah, I'll vote for Joe Biden, but are they actually going to show up? Like I was saying earlier, with Bernie Sanders, those voters are going to show up. They gave the guy $20. They're gonna, they drove to the guy's rally. Bernie Sanders having massive rallies is really, really important. A lot of people are like, oh, well, it's just show. They're just showing up for the rallies just because they're curious. They want to see what the guy's about. Maybe there was some of that in 2016, but now they know who he is. He has some of the highest name recognition and some of the highest favorabilities. But my point is this: you think someone's going to drive 45 minutes for a rally, to listen to some guy speak and then won't ultimately show up at the polls? No, of course they're going to, if someone is going to take their time out of their day to go to a rally or to give someone money, they're definitely going to go out and vote. When it comes to Biden, he doesn't have that kind of grassroots fundraisers, and his rallies are really, really small. So when it comes to electing Joe Biden, sure, yeah, people might answer the phone and say, yeah, I'll vote for him. But that doesn't mean they're actually going to show up finally. And again, these numbers are hardly any better than Bernie Sanders. And there's still that poll right here, you can see, which shows Donald Trump ahead, whereas Bernie Sanders in that same poll shows him ahead. So, at the very least, very, very least, Bernie Sanders is not less electable than Joe Biden. And so the question becomes, who is more likely to be able to, push push the party in the direction which you see. But honestly, again, I think the argument suggests that Bernie Sanders is more electable because, again, look here at these poll numbers. When it came to Iowa and New Hampshire, as soon as Joe Biden started losing, his support just plummeted. Why? Because Joe Biden's support was all based on, oh, I'm the most electable, I'm the most electable. But as soon as you start losing, you're no longer electable. It's show up or put up. If you can't show that you're able to win this thing, if you can't show that, then yeah, nobody actually supports you anymore. And so when it comes to Bernie Sanders, there's a lot more of people who need permission to vote for him because Bernie Sanders, again, has the highest favorability of all the candidates. And so as soon as the polls start showing, oh, Bernie Sanders might be able to win, people are like, oh yeah, I like the guy, I'm going to vote for him. So the idea that, oh, Bernie Sanders can't actually get these moderate independents voters to come up to show up for him doesn't even really make sense because they already like the guy. They already like him. Because again, it's not about getting voters who, might go Republican, might go Democrat. It's about getting Democrat voters to show up, even the more moderate and, even the more moderate ones. And again, Bernie Sanders having the highest favorabilities, who do you think is going to be able to do that? Having the highest grassroots donors, having, a really diverse coalition of non-white voters, of people of color, of Latinos, of, Black people, of everyone. Bernie Sanders is able to really be able to really do that. In fact, like again, there was a recent poll showing Bernie Sanders with a 19-point lead in Nevada. Why is this important? If Bernie Sanders is able to win Nevada, he very well may be able to pull it out in South Carolina, or at the very least tie up with Joe Biden. There was a poll recently showing Bernie Sanders tied with Joe Biden in South Carolina. That's important. That shows you that Bernie Sanders is really, really competitive in all the different types of states, essentially. And so I really think that, when it comes to the question of electability, we're really looking at an instance where Bernie Sanders is up on top. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Krystal there at the end was touching on the idea that economic populism can serve as a unifying message for the working class. And I think that this is really, really right. When it comes to Bernie Sanders, he's talking about questions of human flourishing. He's talking about healthcare. He's talking about minimum wage. He's talking about putting workers on corporate boards in order so that you can have more control over your life. Those are things which really unify different groups of people. It unifies women. It unifies gay people. It unifies trans people. These are questions which directly affect every single one of us. One of the hit points which Elizabeth Warren used to use on Joe Biden a long time ago. She hasn't really been using him to criticize Joe Biden anymore, sadly, but she used to hit Joe Biden and say, look, women's issues are not just about domestic violence and about divorce law, about, marriage law. Women's issues also are about credit card debt. Women's issues is also about student loan debts, where now women have more student loan debt than men. And I think that Bernie Sanders does a really good job of tapping into those concerns. Now, he does also talk about specific issues to specific communities, right? He's not neglecting that. But he talks about how these big, broad questions of healthcare, about wages, about control over your own life in terms of being able to have workers on the boards, in terms of having control at your workplace, how those issues affect every single community, as opposed to trying to talk about, these are gay issues. These are women's issues. These are all human issues to Bernie Sanders. He talks about things in the context of human flourishing and not just in the context of, okay, well, what are the things which polls well for your demographic group, right? He talks about broad issues which poll well overall across the electorate, like Medicare for all, and then talks about how that issue affects every single how that issue affects every single demographic group. And it is an entirely different way of conceiving of politics. It is an entirely different way of doing politics. And honestly, I don't think that not just the mainstream media, but even sometimes Bernie supporters, I don't think that a lot of people realize just how revolutionary Bernie Sanders' entire approach to politics is, entire conception of the way we think about politics is. And I honestly think that that's why when it comes to who's most electable, I think Bernie Sanders really is the most electable. Now, that doesn't mean that I think, if Bernie Sanders wins the nominations, it's a sure shot that he's going to win the general election. I'd like to think that, but look, a lot of things could happen. But I do think, again, he's the best shot he's the best shot we got when it comes to the nomination. But regardless, you know, we got to work hard. We got to work hard for the nomination. We're obviously gonna have to work hard in the general election if we want to pull it out and win this thing. In any case, if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.